Let's go to the phone lines and welcome in Pat Smith now to the program. Pat, I really appreciate your time this morning. Tommy and I were just joking around a little bit. Guys, if y'all could pop them on for me, my internet's not working. The picture you posted, Tommy and I, we've never seen it before. It looked like a cabinet picture, as he was just talking about. What was your reaction when you were bummed that Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher were not sitting next to each other?
Well, it was interesting, guys, because a couple of days beforehand, I was told that everybody was going to be sitting in alphabetical order. Now, when I posted that picture, a lot of people said, well, it was an alphabetical order based on the school. Of course, Jimbo is the chairperson of the coaching committee, so that's why he was sitting at the front of the dais. I guess that's the way you would call it, the room or whatever. And so it was funny because most people like myself, when I got the seating chart, when I found out exactly where everybody was sitting, I was like, well, this is pretty interesting that Jimbo is being flanked by all the other SEC officials, I guess, to make sure that there wasn't any kind of, fisticuffs or anything going on between Nick and Jimbo. But he was the chairperson. But it was interesting to see that good old Sam Pittman and Nick Saban sat next to each other. But if you go alphabetically, you got Arkansas and Alabama right next to each other. But just thinking that Jimbo was sitting there at that table and the person directly across from him in his sight line was Lane Kiffin, who was probably making jokes and laughing the whole time Jimbo was trying to give a presentation. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that would be funny, like if you see Kiffin sitting there tweeting in the room and then you hear Saban's phone dinging on the other end of the table and he starts chuckling a little bit. Now, that would be a funny moment to see if Fisher could handle that moment, leading as the chair of the coaches committee, because he would have to know they're talking about him at that point.
Well, it's almost like when you go to a party sometimes, or you go somewhere and they say, okay, you need to put your cell phones, in this basket, you can't use them during the service or whatever the case may be. I figured that's what happened when those coaches went into the room, especially Lane Kiffin, because you never know when he's going to be tweeting something.
Yeah. All right, so seriously, you were there. What's the most important decision, the most important vote that the presidents and chancellors had? What meeting yielded the best decision this past week in Destin for the Southeastern Conference?
Well, I will tell you and it's not going to get a lot of press. Now, it might in the state of Arkansas, and it did a little bit here in the state of Alabama because, quickly, you've got Auburn and Alabama basketball, kind of a resurgence over the last couple of years. Arkansas, obviously a perennial power in the SEC. As it was about what they're going to do once Texas and Oklahoma come into the league. What are you going to do with the basketball tournament? That was agreed upon by the men's and the women's side of things, but they're so far apart, guys, in regards to what they're going to do with the scheduling model. Are we doing the 1-7, the one permanent opponent, and then the 7 rotational games? Or are we going to do the 3-6, having the 3 rivals every single year, then the rotation of the 6 other opponents? They can't come to an agreement. ESPN wants them to have that additional game because they own the rights, they have the inventory, they want more product that they could put out there and sell better advertising. Meanwhile, the SEC coaches are dragging their feet because they're not, hold on a second, we're not so sure about this because with not knowing what the college football playoff is going to do with their expansion, if it stays at 4, why would we add an additional game in conference play? Because we're doing fine right now as a conference, putting 2 teams in the national championship last game based on an 8-game conference schedule. So they're really dragging their feet. Again, you got the television partner wanting one thing. You got the coaches in the room want another thing. And so they're just really, there's no need for them to make a decision now. They believe they kind of moved the ball a little bit closer to the goal line, but you have the back-end schools in the conference, and I'm talking about the schools that have problems every year making a bowl game, becoming bowl eligible. They're really having a hard time trying to convince those guys that they need to add another tough game on the schedule in the conference, because at that point in time, it might be difficult for some schools to even become bowl eligible.
We're talking with Pat Smith, co-host of 3-Man Front here on the Morning Rush. Pat, when you look at Alabama, and let's say they take the model of the 3 permanent opponents, it's going to be Auburn, it's going to be Tennessee. You probably have a better idea who the other 3. For Arkansas, SEC will pit them with Missouri, and then the other 2 opponents are interesting. So I do wonder when making those decisions, How satisfied do you think fans are going to be when they come up with those results if they indeed go to that 3 permanent and 6 rotating games?
Well, I tell you what, it's a very interesting conversation that we have here in the state of Alabama because obviously you're not going to touch the Iron Bowl. That goes without saying. Both fan bases will agree upon that. But when you got Alabama, historically Tennessee was always one of the biggest rivalry games. Well, Tennessee has not beaten Alabama since Nick Saban has been in Tuscaloosa. So Tennessee fans, they don't view it as a rivalry. Most Alabama fans think of it just as another game like they're playing Mississippi State. Most people say you can't lose the LSU game with Alabama. So then you get into the conversation, well, okay, then where's that third game? A lot of people want to point to Mississippi State because they have played a very long time in the series. Plus, it's the closest university to Alabama in the Southeastern Conference. Plus, they beat up on them pretty regularly, so they would like to have at least one of those permanent SEC opponents as a given victory because you can't line up Vanderbilt. You can't line up some other teams in the conference that have not done well. Meanwhile, on the Auburn side, Auburn and Georgia, it's the longest rivalry in the SEC. Are you going to do away with that? And then if you're Auburn, you still got to play Alabama. So that's 2 very tough opponents. So where does Auburn go for that third game? So it's an intriguing conversation in this state in regards to what that third game would be. Most Alabama fans would say, hey, we want that LSU game. That game means so much to us. I think it would be a very tough schedule, but I think they would take LSU, perhaps Auburn and Tennessee as their 3. But Auburn, with them being on that side of the state and closer to the Floridas and, perhaps even throwing in a South Carolina, somebody like that, you're just really not sure what direction they're going to go in. But I would think, and you guys would know better, but with Arkansas, I would think that their old rivalries with the likes of Oklahoma and Texas, would be thrown in the mix, and maybe with Texas A&M.
Yeah. Pat, I've been a proponent and proliferating the idea of 9 games, but moving Alabama and Auburn to the east, also Missouri to the west, and you bring Oklahoma and Texas into the west. And if you sit down and you draw it out, all the natural rivals that you still need would be intact in your divisions. You play your division games under a 9-game format, and then you cross over and you play 2 on a rotating basis from the other division, 1 home, 1 away every year. You have 9 games, but Alabama, Tennessee is still there. Auburn, Georgia is still there if you have Bama and Georgia in the East. Over in the West, you would have A&M and Texas, which would be back. Oklahoma, Texas. You would still have Ole Miss and Mississippi State. There'd be a few games like Alabama and LSU that would only come around on a rotation. But for the most part, the in-state and the long-standing rivalries that we've known within the conference, for the most part, would all remain intact. But it seems like divisions is getting no traction. Has anyone, your direction, ever thought of it that way with Bama and Auburn in the East and Oklahoma and Texas in the West and move Missouri over?
Yes, absolutely. First off, Tommy, you make perfect sense. And that's something that you could throw out the window when we're talking about college football these
Absolutely.
days. That makes perfect sense. Even though it would be, Georgia fans would not be happy with that. Billy Napier probably wouldn't be happy about that, putting Alabama and Auburn. Keep in mind, guys, Alabama and Auburn, they recruit against Georgia and Florida all the time because down in the Florida Panhandle and, of course, South Georgia and stuff like that in Atlanta. So there's always the recruiting aspect of it. That makes perfect sense. From a geographic standpoint, Missouri should have never been put in the East anyway. That was ridiculous. So this would be a way for them to right the wrong. The problem is that the pod system or even the divisional mindset that we've had since 1992, that's going to be out the window because there has been absolutely no traction whatsoever to even do the pod system, because I would think that the pod system would allow you to correct some of those wrongs, Tommy, as you just mentioned. But unfortunately, what they're wanting to do in every conference now is just to throw all members. You got your standings. You're going to get your 2 best teams, and hopefully you can rotate that schedule enough to where it's a competitive balance. So whoever gets to Atlanta, it's going to be your best opportunity to get to the college football playoff.
Yeah, and I think Ty and I agree solely on this point. I want what's best for me and my season ticket book. And if I have to live in a world where
absolutely,
if I live in a world where OU and Texas aren't on the schedule every year and one of those teams coming to my house, I'm not for that. we want to play A&M every year somewhere, and hopefully home and home again. LSU's been a long stay. Those are the games that I don't want to see come around every 4 years. But if OU and Texas, border rivals for Arkansas, aren't on your schedule every year, what are we doing here?
No, you're absolutely right, because part of the reason and the attraction of why you're bringing Texas and Oklahoma in the league is because of some of these great rivalries that they used to have. Obviously, with Oklahoma, used to be in the old Big 8 conference and then the Big 12 conference, and those schools in the Southwest Conference as well with Arkansas. So this is a time to try to reestablish those long-standing rivalries. And it's a great football game. I mean, look at the competition level between Arkansas and Texas A&M over the course of the last 7 to 8 years. Granted, both sides, when they go into the game, might not have the record that the fan base wants, but it's always a very entertaining and competitive game. Then you throw Oklahoma and Texas into the mix. It's just great for college football, and it's going to be great for the conference. So hopefully cooler heads will prevail. In the SEC office, they have gone through so many different models in regards to what kind of scheduling they want. But as of right now, the problem is, like I said before, it's the college football playoff expansion. How many teams are going to be in it, how the SEC is going to look from there before they can go ahead and commit to that ninth game.
Pat Smith with us here on the Morning Rush, WJOX in Birmingham. Pat, I think one of the things that a lot of our audience wants to know about Week 5 of the college football season is, does Arkansas have enough this year to finally dethrone Alabama, something they have not done since Nick Saban arrived? You listen to callers and fans every single day. Bama's got 5 tough road games this year. 4 tough road games. Sorry, Texas, Ole Miss, we're not going to count Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, and LSU. Of those games, what's the feel from the fans that you feel like they're most worried about with Bama's road schedule?
Honestly, none of them. Zero. I mean,
fully expect
no offense. No offense to any of those teams, because I do think that this is going to be a very, very tough SEC year for everybody. I mean, I think the talent level is going to be spread so evenly, and seeing what Pittman has done there in Arkansas, having Jefferson back. Let me tell you something. You got a transfer wide receiver from Oklahoma. I saw him in high school, and it's really funny because I do play-by-play for a local suburban high school here in Birmingham, and Malachi Moore, who is one of the DBs at Alabama, who was on the All-SEC defensive freshman team just a couple of years ago, he was the cornerback of the high school that I was broadcasting, and Hazelwood's team from Cedar Grove, Georgia, came over, and those two guys went up against each other every single play because they were just throwing the football all around the place. And let me tell you something. He was by far the best wide receiver in that recruiting class. And I know that he got injured there at Oklahoma. Things didn't work out. But I'm telling you, I know it's not Burks, but, I mean, having him come in, and if he's healthy, he's going to be somebody, because you remember last year against Alabama, had their secondary just had fits that day against Arkansas. So I think Arkansas, having established quarterback coming back, I do have my questions on the defensive side for Arkansas, which I'm sure you guys talk about on a pretty regular basis. But in regards to who might give Alabama a battle in the West, I think it's going to come down to that October 8th game there in Tuscaloosa, because, listen, we're already counting it down. We're 121 days away from Jimbo Fisher coming to Tuscaloosa. that is going to be a must-have ticket. It's gonna rival some of those Les Miles and Ed Orgeron games of the century there at Bryant-Denny Stadium. So if Alabama if they keep Bryce Young upright, because after him on the quarterback depth chart, kind of a question mark. They've got dudes, but they just don't have any experience. If you keep him upright, the kind of defensive pressure that Will Anderson Jr. and Dallas Turner is going to put on any type of opposition, it's just going to be very difficult to score a lot of points against Alabama. I'm not calling them like Georgia's defense last year, but they're going to be even better than what they were last year. So as long as Bryce Young stays healthy and some of the transfer portal guys that Bama's had, there is no reason why Bama should not be undefeated heading to Atlanta.
Yeah.
Well, Pat, to that point, Arkansas fans want to thank Dallas Turner, because if he hadn't stepped up for the injury of Drew Sanders would not be transferring to Arkansas, and they would not have him on his roster. I want to go to another game. That's the Auburn game, and since those are the two teams you primarily cover, Pat, Auburn to me just looks like an absolute bleep show heading into this season. I'm surprised Harsin kept his job. You'd know better than I. And Arkansas hadn't won there since, I think, 2012 in Jordan-Hare Stadium. What are the chances you're giving the Razorbacks to finally win for the first time in over a decade in Auburn, Alabama?
Well, listen, I point out on our show anytime that it comes up that Arkansas did win at Auburn a couple years ago. They got screwed. I mean, let's just be honest. The refs were unkind to the Hogs that day.
You just gained a lot of fans. You got to gain a lot of fans, Pat, with that comment.
Well, I'm just telling. Listen, Auburn has benefited. I mean, think about the call at Ole Miss a couple years ago on a so-called the ball did not touch the punters, the receiving on the punting team's hands there at Vaught-Hemingway, and that could have been an easy Ole Miss victory against Auburn. Of course, that game against Arkansas I just referenced. You know, as long as I've been covering Auburn football, Auburn is just being Auburn. And what I mean by that is because they can't get out of their way sometimes. And I'm talking about, you know, you got the boosters always looking for a coup d'etat and taking this over and doing this and doing that. And finally, they stood up to those guys. And that's why Brian Harsin is still the head football coach. You know, Harsin came in obviously a difficult situation with Malzahn leaving in December. That recruiting class that first year was not very good because Harsin came in late. He just has not developed the relationship with the high school coaches across the state, kind of had a turnover early in the season on his coaching staff. But since what happened in February and March of this year, Harsin's really done a nice job in which he's embracing the Auburn family. You know, he went to a bunch more basketball games. You really rarely saw him the year before doing a lot of stuff outside of the football office building. Him and Bruce Pearl, pretty good relationship. You know, he's been at baseball games. He was at Talladega. You know, he was the grand marshal there, played at a celebrity golf tournament here in Birmingham. He's doing things to try to get himself back up there to ingrain himself amongst the Auburn people. Now, we all know, guys, if you go 500 and, you know, you're 6th or 7th in the SEC West while you got Alabama doing what they're doing on the western side of the state, that's a problem for anybody. And I had a guy on the show yesterday that said that Auburn will go 7-5, but Brian Harsin will be fired. I mean, that's the kind of undercurrent you have in this state where, I mean, it might not be fair, but you're always going to be compared to what's going on in Tuscaloosa. And especially when you're your biggest rival, I mean, you got to win more than 7 games. And that's what he's looking at this year. Their quarterback situation's up in the air. Zach Calzada coming in as a transfer, TJ Finley, who filled in for Bo Nix last year. And, of course, Bo Nix is now at Oregon. So, you know, that's going to be the competition going into the fall. They don't have a lot of, you know, experience at the wideout position. They got some dudes coming back on defense. So it is really going to be an interesting set of things to look at when it comes to Auburn this upcoming year. And, listen, if he does go 7-5 or 6-6 again, you really could hear those drums beating a lot louder for his future and perhaps a change down the plane.
Pat, we'll leave it there. Appreciate your time. Do me a favor at SEC Media Days, vote Arkansas 5th so they can have a lot of motivation. We need the entire SEC media to vote them 5th in the West so they can be ticked off like they were last year.
Well, let me tell you this, because I heard some of y'all's comments yesterday. You said you'd love to get on the plane and see that as motivation for Arkansas. And if I do vote the way I feel, not because I'm on an Arkansas radio show, but it just in my conscience, I cannot vote them 5th in the SEC West. They're going to be much better than that. I think that Sam Pittman, I'm telling you, I would want my kid to play for Sam Pittman every single day of the week and twice on Sunday because he is that good and he's just a good football coach. You got a good one up there.
Pat, good stuff there, and hope we can talk. Hope Ty and I can talk to you again before football season rolls around.
Absolutely, guys. Anytime. Y'all have a good day.
All right, Pat Smith, WJOX. That's a great conversation, Ty, and some really good stuff there from behind the scenes at SEC Media Days.
Yeah, he had it, man. So appreciate Pat joining us.
Partners at BetOnline continue to be the #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, including updated odds on the NBA playoffs, fights, and even next season's futures. And don't forget that the MLB is back as well. Who are you picking to win the World Series? BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino and poker games. It's super easy to get started. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to join and use our promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet online, where the game starts.